Um, Hi, everyone. Sorry about that little intro there. Welcome to the session today with Jessica Dolce. And you may have attended her other session before this. And before I introduce her, I just want to go over a few quick things about the BoomSet platform. If you haven't, you're probably familiar from other sessions you've attended, but just quickly today, we're just going to use the group chat and the Q&A for this session. So those are the only two tabs you'll need. And then at the end of the presentation, we're going to keep it open for another 15 minutes for anyone who wants to stay and keep talking with each other or with Jessica. So we will do that. And then just quickly, I'll introduce you to Jessica. She is a certified compassion fatigue educator. She has more than 15 years of experience in animal welfare, and she created the Compassion in Balance program. If you want to check it out on her website, it's an online compassion fatigue education program for animal shelters. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Jess.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. I just saw Chris is here from Scarborough, Westbrook. Many years ago, I worked at ARL in Westbrook. So hello to you. I'm going to share my screen. Let's see. Get my slides up here. So can you all see this? Mariah, can you just tell me because I can't see the chat anymore. I'm assuming you all can see my slides. All right, awesome. Just making sure it's not just me and my dog that are watching this. So today we're going to talk about what I call pumping the brakes, which is what to do when you feel like you're really spinning out on stress. And so just in terms of housekeeping, Mariah, I think already went over it, but there is a PDF that if you don't have now, you will get access to it, and it will give you some more resources and ideas to learn more after today is over. But our goal for today's session is really to look at how do we increase our resiliency and minimize the risk for burnout by learning personal coping skills, sometimes called self-regulation, in relation to our stress response. And we'll be looking at a variety of ways that we can help ourselves cope with stress, but with a heavy focus on self-regulation. I want to make it clear that that is just one slice of the stress management and well-being pie. So it's not everything, but it is an important foundational piece of our well-being on the job and off. And so kind of talking about the pie and slices of it, I think it's helpful to start by looking at this little graphic from Dr. Deb Thompson, who put this out pretty close to the start of COVID over a year ago to remind us that in February of 2020, most of us weren't feeling awesome to begin with. A lot of us were experiencing compassion fatigue and burnout and pre-existing stress and worries before COVID hit. Then March 2020 rolls around and we're dealing with this massive global pandemic. Then we deal with things like racial violence and political unrest, multiple natural disasters, multiple mass shootings. It is no wonder that we're all pretty stressed out and maybe struggling right now. So much of our resources has had to be shifted towards coping with COVID and all of these major stressors that we have been experiencing over the past year, which means we have less than normal available for our own, energy and engagement with the work, and our ability to focus or feel motivated has been pretty compromised this past year. I share this only because if you're having a hard time right now, if you don't feel as engaged with the work as usual, if little things are really stressing you out, that seems like a very normal reaction to the intense stress load that we've all been carrying for the last year, which is only built on some of the difficulties we were experiencing beforehand. The thing about life, though, is that we can't stop stressful, challenging, and upsetting and difficult things from happening. It's a part of being alive. And so I love this quote from Jon Kabat-Zinn, who reminds us you can't stop the waves, but you can learn to surf. And that's really about resiliency. How do we navigate those challenges with more skill or support or tools so that we don't get knocked down by those waves quite as often, or when we do, we're able to get back up maybe a little easier than before. of course, I don't know about you. I grew up in New Jersey and Philadelphia. I've been in Maine for about 13 years. I have never surfed a day in my life. So I think for New England, this is a much better metaphor. You can't stop the blizzard, but you can learn how to drive in the snow, right? And that's really what we'll be playing with today, this kind of car metaphor. It's inevitable we're going to hit snow and ice. Do we have the skills that we need to navigate it safely, rather than just spinning out all the time? So here's the thing about stress. It's not bad. We need a certain amount of stress to perform. Without any stress right now, I would just be on the floor drooling. Like, I'm glad that I'm a little stressed out by public speaking, because it helps me to get activated so I can meet the challenge. It's adaptive. It's helpful. What we're talking about when we talk about bad stress is really something called distress. It's chronic stress. It's the kind of stress that when we're exposed to it over time really can become toxic and lead to physical and mental health outcomes that are really harmful. So whether that's fatigue or anxiety or any sort of physical health problem. So we don't want to hang out in distress, but I'm not saying that we want to be not stressed. That's not what we're aiming for. We're really looking for that sweet spot in the middle. And there are ways that we can help shift ourselves towards good stress. And there are 3 ways that we're going to focus on doing that today. If we can change any of the following conditions, it can help to reduce the harmful effects of stress on our mental and physical health and increase our overall resilience. If we can shift from feeling out of control to in control, from isolation to connection, meaningless to meaningful. And we're going to spend quite a bit of time in the beginning looking at how do we shift to feeling in control. So before we do that, we have to spend a little time talking about what's happening with our brain and our body when we're on stress. And I think the Cliff Notes version is we're just Muppet arms in our brain when we're really stressed out. That's how I like to think of my brain when I'm stressed. But let's get into it a little bit more deeply. So a pop quiz, you can answer in the chat, and Mariah, you can let me know what the chat responses are. How many times a day do you think the average person in an average year, not a helping professional, not during COVID, how many times a day is the average person's stress response, their fight, flight, or freeze response, triggered? Is it A, 50 times a day, B, 12 times a day, or C, 39 times a day? What's your best guess? And if you know it, maybe wait a sec to let other people throw some guesses out there. So what are your guesses? Do we have a kind of a theme, or are we all over the place?
There's a lot of B's and C's. Fewer A's.
You all ready? The answer is A, 50. Oh, and that's the average person on an average day. Not a helping professional, not during COVID. So that's really alarming because that means that, let's say we sleep 6 or 7 hours a night. That means that our fight or flight response is being triggered multiple times, that we are awake every day. And that is where we're getting into distress and problematic outcomes for ourselves. So why? Why is our stress response so active? One reason is because our nervous system, which really controls our stress response, loves predictability and control and certainty and stability, because that feels safe, right? Our nervous system only perceives things as safe or dangerous. And as long as things are predictable and we feel a sense of certainty, we feel pretty safe. And I don't know about you, but this past year, there has been no certainty, no stability, no predictability, no sense of control. So that alone has been really problematic this past year. But I would say in our work in general, we often feel like things are unpredictable and out of our control. So in terms of our nervous system, that fight, flight, or freeze mode, otherwise known as our survival mode, is our body's primitive, inborn automatic. It's a reactive it's a reaction that helps to prepare our body to deal with a threat. So back when that was a bear chasing us, it was really helpful that we geared up physiologically to fight it, to run away from it, or to completely shut down so hopefully it wouldn't see us. But what's happening today in our modern world is that everyday parts of our life that are a little upsetting or frustrating or annoying, or just that feeling of being uncertain, is triggering the exact same physiological response as if there were a real threat. So our stress response gets activated just as much from perceived threats to our safety as real threats to our safety. And this is where we're getting in a lot of trouble, because the stress response is meant to be short term to survive that bear. And then we get to reset and heal. But these perceived threats are keeping our stress response chronically activated. Part of that is due, that perception is based in our thoughts. And human beings have this really lovely thing called the anticipatory stress response. This is a great book, if you haven't read it, Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. And the author reminds us that for the vast majority of animals on this planet, stress is a short-term crisis. And the animal either survives it and it's over and they go back to homeostasis and rest, or they die. It's over. Right? It's one or the other. But human beings, in the way that we worry and think about the stressful and uncertain parts of our life, we're turning on that exact same physiological response chronically. And that's what's really leading to all of these health problems that we're having. We're just not meant to be in this state chronically long term. And so in terms of what's happening to us, I think sometimes it's helpful to look at stress kind of in these stages. We perceive through our senses information that's going to our brain. Our brain is deciphering that stimulus as a real threat or not a threat, dangerous or safe. That's it. It's only two choices, dangerous or safe. And we're getting a lot of false alarms. Things like our phone, notifications are being perceived as a threat. Then our body gets activated to deal with the threat, to fight it or flee it. But when the threat is over, in the way that we would want it to be, our body gets to go into a reset, into homeostasis, physiological calmness to restore itself and repair because the threat is over. But in the way that we are living, the way that our modern life is set up, the way we think about things, we're not getting the reset because all of these perceived threats are keeping us really activated. So we're not getting into that rest and restore mode that really allows us to be healthy and well. And so I don't know if anybody's a dog trainer in the room, if always happy to have some dog trainers, particularly if you work with reactive dogs. But, what we're looking in here a lot of times is like trigger stacking, all of these perceived threats, all of these upsets and challenges and, difficulties throughout the day that are relatively minor in and of themselves start stacking up. Stress is cumulative. So we wake up and we are thinking about our bills, some anticipatory worry. We open up our email and it's overwhelming. Then we're trying to rush out the door, but our dog throws up and our stress is just stacking up. All those triggers stacking, getting us closer and closer to threshold. So like for those of you who work with reactive dogs, like this is the moment where they hit threshold and they start barking and lunging at the end of their leash. So maybe you spill your coffee when you get into work and then you get like a last minute request from a coworker, from a member of the public, and you lose it. You explode because you're well over threshold, right? We're not able to reset. We're always at threshold. We're in this state of chronic activation, which is really living in overwhelm. So it's like we're that glass of water that's always full. It's always at threshold. And one little thing happens, one more request comes in, one more ding on our phone. And it's that one more drop in the glass that makes us spill over. And so every little thing becomes a big deal. We become reactive. We're not choosing how we want to behave. We're just having knee-jerk reactions, like the dog at the end of that leash. Our perceptions become really skewed when we're in this state of overwhelm. We get very negative. Everything feels more threatening. Our perspective gets very narrow. There's more conflict and drama. We can't stop worrying. There's a lot of rumination. Our mind just kind of eats itself with a lot of worry. We start making bad self-care choices, and we do things that we regret when we're in this chronically activated state of overwhelm. So why do we do things that we really regret? Why do people around us do things that they really regret? It's what's happening in our brain. So some of you may be familiar with Dr. Dan Siegel's work, and he talks about the hand model of the brain. And so if you're using your hand as a model, your front knuckles are the yellow part of the brain on the screen here, the prefrontal cortex. This is what really separates us from, other animals. This is where we are able to really access our rational thought, our communication skills, our ability to regulate our emotions, to access empathy, problem solve, all the things that we need to do our jobs well and to feel proud of ourselves are coming from here. And when we go into the stress response, we essentially flip our lids And that part of our brain goes offline while our resources are really being driven towards the downstairs brain, the brain stem and the limbic system, the dinosaur part of our brain, the reptilian part, which is much more reactive. And its only job is to help you survive, right? It's to help you survive this perceived or real threat. And so we do things that we regret later, but in the moment felt like a good survival choice. But immediately after, we realize not so much. We wish that we hadn't done that. So if we want to live in a way where we have real choice about how we want to behave, if we want to live with integrity and dignity, we need our prefrontal cortex online. And so self-regulation, what we're going to be talking about today is how do we keep our lid on, or how do we recognize that we are about to or have flipped our lid or gone over a threshold, and how do we bring that lid back on so that we can feel better and perform well. I just want to say that when we do or say stuff that we deeply regret almost immediately after, it really is the downstairs brain that is calling the shots. It's like we're being hijacked by our amygdala, which is the alarm bell of our brain. And so that's not to excuse bad behavior. We have to take responsibility for ourselves, but it does help us to understand why we do these things, to take some of the shame out of it so that we can make better repairs, so that we can prevent ourselves from causing harm in the future. We need to really understand what's happening for ourselves. So, it takes some of, I think, the blame and shame out of it. We often feel so bad about ourselves afterwards to understand what's going on in the brain. And that helps us to do things differently the next time. So here's a question for all of you. One of the ways that we start to learn how to work with our stress response is to identify the specific triggers at work that set off your fight, flight, or freeze response. So I'd love to know in the chat what quickly leads to either big overreaction, that's the fight or flight, or shutting way down, which is the freeze. And I want you to think about things like smells, sounds, particular ways that people might talk to you, tasks. And I'd love for you all to share, because we're all stressed by different things. So it can be really helpful to get a sense of like, oh, these are the different ways that people's stress response gets set off. It's different than mine. It's helpful to understand, especially my coworkers or my staff, what's really, pushing their buttons. So some ideas, as you write in the chat, are things like loud noises, like in the kennels, the sound of notifications on your phone or walkie-talkie sounds, being talked down to, being excluded, perceptions of unfairness, crowds, all kinds of things can trigger a stress response. And these are not actual threats to our survival, but they are frustrations or annoyances or challenges, or just make our nervous system feel unsafe. So what are some of the things that you all are sharing? I'm hoping you are.
Trying to talk to someone who isn't paying attention and they're looking at their phone, people talking down to me, clients reacting to their own stress by getting short with me. When a manager or boss asks, "Do you have a moment?" Very stressed dogs vocalizing.
Dogs barking in the car. Anybody? Like if you're doing transports, animals just like making a lot of noise in vehicles. Definitely does that. Interruptions, being interrupted often does that for us. I just want to say a quick side note about that. Can I speak with you for a moment from managers? If there are managers in the room, one of the ways we can help our staff with this is to actually just start saying that a lot more often, and then giving them really positive news, like appreciation, so that we can start to condition them to think about good things. Because if we only call them in every once in a while, and it's always for a problem, it's always going to set off their stress response. So we can kind of temper that by having people come to talk to us and sharing really good, appreciation and praise for them, because that definitely sets off my stress response too. So I get it. Anything else that popped up?
Hearing people raising their voice with the dogs in frustration.
Yeah.
A lot of animals being stressed or scared.
What about your phones? Text messages, dings, anything around that? Seeing a lot, push notifications.
I think I don't see any here, but a lot of people are kind of saying people half listening. So other people not paying attention. But somebody just commented that they shut off their sound and leave it on vibrate.
Yeah, I had to do the same thing. Absolutely. Yeah. Okay. So the point is, like, these are all different flavors of the way that interacting with our job and the people that we work with, and even sometimes our devices or their devices, are setting off our stress response. So it's pushing us into a reaction that may not be particularly helpful, right? We don't necessarily need that whole physiological response in order to deal with this frustrating thing that might be happening. And so when we feel out of control around any of those triggers, it just increases our stress. We want to feel in control in order to reduce our stress levels. So we have to look for a sense of control over any of the triggers that you just mentioned. And sometimes we can control the situation. Like you were saying with your phone, you can control that. You turn it on vibrate. But sometimes we have no control over how other people behave or the sounds that an animal makes. And so we have to then find a sense of control by focusing on how we're going to cope with this stressor that we can't avoid. And so that's really where the skill of self-regulation comes into play, because that is moving ourselves from this physiological state of reactivity to a more calm, grounded, responsive state in the face of a perceived threat. So to be clear, this is not for when you're experiencing a real threat. If you are truly not safe, let your fight, flight, or freeze response kick in and take care of you. But all these perceived threats, the challenges, the frustrations, the upsets that are technically not a risk to your actual safety, we want to self-regulate so that we feel steadier in our bodies. We stay in our ability to make choices because our prefrontal cortex is engaged, and that allows us to perform better even if things are challenging. And Dr. Gentry, who does a lot of work around helping professionals and trauma exposure, has often said that our quality of life as helping professionals is dependent on us being able to monitor and regulate our autonomic nervous system. So how do we do this? How do we self-regulate? There's 3 bits that we're going to go through. It's awareness. We need to know what's going on internally, as well as the awareness of what our stress triggers are specifically. We want to assess what's within our zone of control, and we want to address it, often by pumping the brakes on our stress response. So the first bit is awareness. Our body knows that we are stressed long before our brain does. Our body is very, very fast and is already reacting before our brain can even really understand what's going on. And that usually is great if we're in a real safety issue, like it'll keep us alive. But in order for us to manage our stress response, we need to tune in to what's going on with our body more often throughout the day, which can be really hard for us to do because we're so outwardly focused on the animals and people in our care and all the fires that we need to put out, that we can be really disconnected from our internal experience. And so what I'd encourage you to do now is to think about what's the very first thing that happens in your body when you start to get real activated by stress. It is different for each one of us. So for some of us, our hands immediately start to shake, or we get flushed cheeks. Some of us, our stomach does a flip flop, or we start pouring sweat, or our jaw gets really, really tight. What's the very first thing that you notice when you are experiencing stress? What's the first obvious physical change? And if you know that, or if you don't, another way to think about it is, how does your behavior change? So I'd love for you to answer in the chat if you can identify the first big obvious physical change, and or how your behavior changes. Some of the common ones are we start getting really loud, or we shut down and we literally can barely talk at all. Some of us burst into tears. Some of us cannot make eye contact. So there's different ways that our behavior starts to change when we go into fight, flight, or freeze. So what are some of the ways? And again, this is helpful to share with your coworkers, not as an excuse, but just so we can understand. Like, oh, okay, when Jessica gets really stressed, she can't make eye contact. That's not personal towards me. That's just what's happening for her. And if we give it a few minutes, she'll be able to re-engage with the conversation. So it's just a way of knowing each other so we don't take things so personally. So what have we got in the chat? What's showing up?
A lot of stomach hurts, stomach plummets, tight chest, heart racing, flushed cheeks, hands shaking, sweaty palms, clenched jaw, muscles tightening, neck, shoulders.
I get shaky hands almost immediately. Like it all all that adrenaline goes right to my hands. So I don't know if anybody else notices that too. What about behavior? Anything you can think of?
Some people start fidgeting and moving rapidly. Someone also said, I get loud. They get loud when they start getting stressed. They get super defensive, trouble concentrating, laughing, laughing uncontrollably.
That's a good one. No, no one ever says that, but that's a good one. I do it too. It's it's a real way to push out, I think, a lot of stress activation. You're releasing it in a healthy way, but it can really infuriate people. So I have learned over time. So yeah, that's a great one. Thank you for sharing that. No one ever brings that up, and it's a good one.
Yeah, that's Lindsay and Amy from the Feds. Amy is also saying that she also laughs. She's a nervous laugher.
Does anybody shut down where you can't talk? I'm just curious, because a lot of times we take that really personally if someone can't continue a conversation with us.
Yeah, everybody's a lot of agreement.
Yeah. So this is just helpful to know about how it's often, particularly in high stress work environments, we're very quick to take offense just because of what's going on in our brains and our stress response. But so often the things that people are doing that we think are personal or towards us is really just a reflection of how dysregulated they are, how much their stress response has gotten engaged. Again, it's not an excuse to behave poorly, but it's just so we can understand it better, not taking it personally, to be able to advocate for what we need in the moment, or to be able to make a good suggestion like, hey, I think we might need to take a minute here so that we can all get our lids back online. So thank you for sharing all of this. You are all building your self-regulation toolkit. This is one of my favorite quotes of all time from Viktor Frankl. He's a Holocaust survivor who wrote a terrific book called Man's Search for Meaning. If you need a good book to read, pick this little guy up. It's short and brilliant. And he reminded us that between stimulus, which you've already identified, your triggers, and response, which you just identified, your reactions, between stimulus and response, there is a space. And in that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. When we are able to make a conscious choice about how we want to behave, then we get to be our best selves. That's when we get to grow and live with integrity and dignity in this world. And so we always want to stay in or return to, as often as we can, a place of responsiveness and choice versus reactivity, which is just knee-jerk and not really able to think and to choose consciously how we want to engage with the world. So what choices do we have? That's where we start to assess, okay, I'm in the stress response. Let's look at what's within my zone of control here to assess what kind of choices I have available to me. Now, what's within your control is actually really small. Most of the time, the only thing that you have control over in a situation is how you behave, what you focus on. It's your actions. It's the way that you relate to what's happening. We have almost zero control over what other people do or what the animals are doing. We can sometimes influence other people and animals, but ultimately we do not have full control over them. We also don't have control over the outcomes of much of the work that we do, which is really painful, but we do have control over the way that we engage with the work, the quality of the process, even if we can't control the outcome. And so when it comes to stress management and self-regulation, we want to focus on what's within our control. And what's within our control is addressing the stress by making a choice. Do I want to keep hitting that gas pedal of fight or flight, or do I want to start pumping the brakes? And so a very brief and reduced version of the autonomic nervous system is this is in control of things like breathing and your heart rate. And it's automatic. You're not consciously influencing this. Thank goodness, because if I had to tell my lungs to breathe, I would just drop dead right now. I would forget to do it. So it's all happening automatically outside of our conscious awareness. And we have these two branches, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic is the brakes on our stress response, fight or flight. And we also don't have a lot of conscious control over this. It's very fast. It's happening before our mind even knows what's what. And again, this is great when there's a real threat to our survival. So I always think about, going the car metaphor, like if I get cut off or I almost rear end someone, I don't tell my armpits to start sweating and my heart to start pounding. It just happens without me being involved in it, right? My body just takes care of it. It got geared up to deal with this threat. So we don't have a lot of conscious control over whether or not we get triggered because it's happening so quickly, but we do have the ability to consciously influence and engage our parasympathetic nervous system, which is the brakes on our stress response and brings us back to, rest and repair and restore, or rest and digest. We can make choices when we notice that we are in fight or flight, because we're being aware, that we can start to engage the brakes and calm ourselves down. And so how do we do that? How do we pump the brakes both alone and together with our staff or our kids or anybody that, is in our life? How do we get our brain and our body working together? It really is bottoms up. I don't think there's supposed to be an apostrophe in there. Yeah, I think it's just, so there you go. There's a little. That makes my stress response active. I really hate a typo. But the idea here is that we never want to tell ourselves or someone else to just calm down, right? Which is what we tend to do. But there's really nothing more stressful than being told to calm down, because when we do that to ourselves or others, what we're doing is we're really appealing to a top-down process. We're appealing to our prefrontal cortex and our rational brain to say, hey, there's no real threat here. It's cool. Calm down. There's no need to be this jacked up. Let's get it. It's no big deal. You can handle it. But we are talking to a part of our brain that is offline. We aren't able to access that part of our brain when we're in fight, flight, or freeze. So we need to be really talking to our bodies in this moment, going bottoms up, to try to help our nervous system feel more safe in the moment so that our prefrontal cortex can come back online and we can have a more rational discussion. But we cannot have a rational, emotionally regulated discussion with ourselves or anyone else until we calm down that activation in the body first. And so the most simple way to do this is just to remember to stop. When you notice that your stress response is really activated, that you're moving faster, you're talking louder, or your stomach is flip-flopping, stop. Just stop. Stop talking, stop moving, stop doing anything. Take a deep breath. Observe what is going on internally and what's happening around you externally, and then either pull back further because you need more time, or proceed, right? Making good choices for yourself. Of course, we need to flesh this out a little bit more. Breathing, focusing on our breath can often be the easiest way to engage our parasympathetic nervous system, to drop a little anchor in the moment, to stabilize ourselves. Even if the water is really choppy around us, right? It helps us to ground ourselves in the present moment and activate that rest and digest response. And so there's lots and lots of different ways to use breathing to do this. I'm going to walk us through one, but what I want to say is that if focusing on your breath makes you more anxious, which it does for some people, then do not do this exercise. And I've got something for you on the next slide. So also don't tell people to calm down, and don't tell people just to take a deep breath. It doesn't always work. You can suggest it, but understand that that's not always going to be helpful for some folks. So in terms of deep breathing, a really simple practice is something just called Take 5. And so if you want to give this a try, take your hand, place it palm up on your thigh if you're sitting down. And you can keep your eyes open, gazing down, or you can close them if that feels comfortable, whatever feels good for you. And you're just going to take a nice, big, long inhalation and notice the natural pause at the top of your in-breath, and then exhale out completely, noticing the pause at the bottom of your breath. Fold your first finger in. That was take 1. Inhale, following the whole length of your breath, noticing the pause. Exhale, following the full length of your breath, and notice that natural pause. Fold your second finger in. That was take 2. Inhale, follow the length of your breath to that natural pause at the top. Then follow it all the way back out until you get to that natural pause at the bottom. Fold your third finger in. That was take 3. Inhale, notice the pause. Exhale, notice that pause. Fold your fourth finger in. That was take 4. Inhale, following the whole length of that breath. Notice the pause. Exhale all the way out until you're totally empty. Notice that pause. Flip your hand over, palm down. That was take 5. So if you want, you can open your eyes, or you can just kind of refocus, come back into the room. You have 2 hands, so you can take 10 or take 15 or take 20, but just taking 5 deep breaths can be a big reset to your nervous system, and it can help buy you some time to bring that prefrontal cortex back online so that you can come back to the challenging situation with a clearer head and behave in a way that is more likely to resolve the problem rather than add to it. So if breathing is not for you, breathing's for everybody, but if focusing on your breath is not for you, then another thing that you can do if you're feeling overwhelmed or panicked or whatever it may be, is you can orient to your environment using your senses. So one that has been going around a lot during COVID is the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. It's looking around the room, naming 5 things you can see, 4 things you can feel, 3 things you can hear, 2 things you can smell, and 1 thing you can taste, or any combination. It might be 5 things that you can smell if you're at the shelter. But one thing that I really like that just works super well for me is just to label objects out loud. And so it goes like this: water bottle, cough drops, phone, pen, microphone, paper, books, printer, dog. And you do that 30, 40 times. And what you're doing is you're engaging your prefrontal cortex by using language. And you are also grounding yourself in your present environment, which is safe. Most of the time we are in future based worries, that anticipatory worry. We're thinking about the future. This brings us back into the present moment where our nervous system can realize I'm actually safe. If you are not safe in your environment, this is not the one to do. But most of the time, not always, but most of the time, technically in the present moment, we're okay. It's what's going on in our head that's really making our nervous system activated. You can also find the rainbow, find everything that's blue in the room or 1 thing from every color of the rainbow. It's all the same principle, re-engaging your prefrontal cortex, helping you to come back into the present moment. Another way to do that is to use present moment awareness in your body by focusing on a point of contact. And so I'd like for you to give this a try as I'm explaining it, if you can. I'd like for you to see if you can notice the feeling of your feet touching the floor or the back of your legs or your butt, point of contact with the seat that you're in, or the point of contact between your hands and your lap, if your hands are on your thighs or on your lap. And you just want to see if you can feel, not think it, but feel the point of contact between these 2 places: feet in the floor, cheeks in your seat, hands on your lap. And to have this awareness of this point of contact, even as you're listening to me speak. Because what's happening, if you can do this, is you are splitting your awareness between focusing on something external and also grounding yourself in this internal experience of what you can feel in that point of contact. Now, this is also really helpful when you're not listening to me talk. You can do this just quietly on your own, refocusing your attention again in that present moment awareness, using that point of contact as a focal point. But I also really like it as a skill for when you are listening to or witnessing upsetting stories or graphic footage, anything at work where you're bearing witness to suffering. You want to be able to stay in your body rather than being lost in what you are witnessing, hearing, or seeing. You want to be able to feel the boundary between you and the animal that's in pain or the person that's in pain. And you can do that by listening, but also keeping a sense of awareness around where you're being held by the chair or the ground or your hands in your pocket. Another thing that we can do is to soothe our nervous system with simple, comforting gestures, like putting your hands over your heart. So if you want to give it a try, take your right hand, put your hand over your heart with your fingers near your collarbone, and then take your left hand and just place it over it. And just a little bit of gentle pressure, whatever feels good, just a little bit of pressure. Noticing the warmth of your hands. You might rub your chest a little bit. not only is this just a very soothing gesture that can feel supportive the way a hug from someone else can feel supportive, but we're also activating our parasympathetic nervous system by pressing on something called the vagus nerve, which runs down the front of our body. And when we activate our vagus nerve, it triggers the parasympathetic response. And so just by pressing on your chest a little bit, it can help to move you out of the stress response. Holding your own hand can do this, rubbing your thumb or rubbing the outside of your ear are also ways to soothe yourself. Humming and singing also do this. You may not be able to do this at work around a lot of people, but maybe in the car. And again, you're activating the vagus nerve. And at home, you might want to try something like a weighted blanket, or my favorite is just a cat that's around 10 pounds or less or more, and putting a cat on your chest or on your stomach, and that activates the vagus nerve as well. And so all these ways are to work with your body to help calm yourself down. We also want to metabolize all that adrenaline, cortisol out of our bodies. We have to discharge all the stress that's being released in our bodies. So long after the trigger is gone and you've done some self-regulation in the moment, we still have to address the fact that we're like being pickled by adrenaline and cortisol every day. We've got to move it out. And so we can do that by crying. Crying is a way to release stress hormones. Laughter is a really great way to move stress activation out of our body. Drinking a lot of water can do this. We're flushing it out. Taking a brisk walk at least a few times a week has been shown to really discharge and metabolize stress out of the body. Dancing is really good for this. So, if you have like a song that you just can't help but wiggle to, a song that just like turns you around, have that accessible to you, in your work vehicle at work. And sometimes you just have to kind of like shake it out a little bit with music helping you out. But one of the ways that's the easiest way to do this, I think, for us, given the work that we do, is we just have to follow what the dogs do all the time, which is they shake their bodies to reset after anything's gotten them really stimulated. So anytime we see a dog shaking, we can remember probably a good idea for us to shake too. Or anytime that we feel a lot of stress activation. I was doing this right before the presentations today because I could feel that I was getting a lot of adrenaline coming up for the presentations that was going to make my lid flip and I would forget everything I wanted to say. So I shook things out a little bit to reset. So if you want to give this a try with me, the benefit is shaking helps, but also you will laugh at me and yourself if you do this. So either way, it's a win, shaking or laughing. But if you want to give this a try, you just start by it's Muppet arms. You get your right hand going really floppy at the wrist and down into your elbow. And if you want to, you can get it all the way into your shoulder, right? And then you get your left hand involved all the way down into the elbow and then the shoulder. So you've got both hands going. If you're standing, you can get one leg, then the other. If you can do both legs at the same time, please send me a video, right? And you're just shaking it out. And then whenever you're done, you might just feel all that energy that's moving through your hands. You're alive. Yay. Life force. Right. Whew. And you just let it go. And this is a really great way to literally move some energy out, to reset. But again, it also gets you grounded back into the present moment. So if you're lost in your thoughts and worries, this gets you back into your body right now. It's pretty helpful. Don't do it right before bed, though. It will wake you up. The idea here is that you are pumping the brakes on your stress response all throughout the day. When we do not manage our stress in any way until we get home at night or the weekends or a day off, which is what most of us do, we leave our stress management until we have time for it. That is the equivalent of driving home at 100 miles an hour and not hitting the brakes until we're already in the driveway. Of course, we're going to crash. Of course, we're going to have an argument with somebody at home. Of course, we're not going to be able to sleep at night. We're super activated from all of this stress all day. So we either crash or we stay really wired. We're wired and or tired when we get home. So we want to pump the brakes all throughout the day. Stress is cumulative. So is stress management. These small moments of taking a moment to take 5 deep breaths, to shake your body out, to go outside and drink a bottle of water. All of these things add up throughout the day and back us out of that overwhelm. And if you're in a leadership position, we need to normalize pausing in our workplace. It's a sign of strength to say, I really want to get to a good outcome, but I can feel, that I'm a lot of stress activation. If I could take 5 minutes to take care of myself right now, I know I can come back to this conversation and really be engaged in a constructive way. Can I do that? right? Or can I take 60 seconds to just step back and take a few deep breaths? Like, to be able to advocate for yourself in this way, it's not taking advantage of anybody. It's really creating an environment and a culture where we understand how the brain and the body works, how the work impacts us, and we are allowed to make and empower others to make smart decisions so we can do our work better. Stress regulation really does create more stress resilience, because every time we get a stress trigger, which is multiple times an hour, if we are allowed to pause by these little things that we might do for ourselves, it brings us back down away from threshold, right? So that we don't flip our lid, so that we don't go over. Or if we do go over threshold, we can bring ourselves back down. When we do not pause, when we do none of this self-regulation, it just builds and builds and builds all day until we're in that chronically activated, overwhelmed state that never works out for anybody. So here's a question for all of you. What helps you when you're feeling really stressed out at work? What are some of the things that you've noticed really make a difference for you? How are we doing on time? When does this end?
We have about 15 minutes for your presentation, and then Q&A time.
Okay.
So people are saying walking, spending time with the animals.
Yeah.
Having something to organize. Yeah. My office cats.
Yeah. Thank goodness for
cats. Some people are talking about meditation. Take 5 to meditate. Petting my dog. Yeah. Deep breathing. A few minutes to laugh with coworkers.
Yeah. All of this is like working with your body, right? It's not about telling your mind, don't be stressed. It's, hey, if I pet my dog for a moment, that relaxes my body. If I take a moment to laugh with my coworkers, then I get to reset physiologically, and then my brain state changes. So I really hope that we understand that these things are really simple, right? But that's because we need to work at the level of our body first. And then we can get more into our brain and more complex cognitive approaches to stress management. So one of the next ways that we can shift towards good stress is to move from a sense of isolation to connection. So I don't know if you all have seen this before, but why would I put up a slide of redwood trees when I am talking about the power of connection? Does anybody have any ideas? You can share in the chat why I might be sharing this image with you, because you might already know.
Someone asked, is it one tree?
Is it one tree? Well, in a way, I think we have a perception that redwood trees are so big and strong, maybe because they have such deep roots, right? Like that's how such an enormous old tree can withstand storms. But what we now know is that they don't actually have very deep roots. Their roots are relatively shallow, but they're all connected, right? So it's this connection to each other. And I guess in some ways, like that's a good way to phrase it. They're all one tree, right? In some ways, that connection is what allows them to be truly resilient to the stressors in their environment. And we're no different. We have a stress response that's really positive. We have fight, flight, and freeze, but we also have something called the tend and befriend response. So in times of stress, we tend to those in need and we befriend each other. It's a real social engagement response to stress. And part of the reason that works for us is because when we're around caring, safe people, we feel, we get a release of oxytocin, the happiness hormone, the bonding hormone. And what we now know from research is that oxytocin interrupts the stress response, and it also prevents the damage that gets done by the stress response. So oxytocin, otherwise kind of known as having great social support, becomes the antidote to all of the cortisol that is pumping through our bodies. It helps to repair the damaging effects of cortisol and interrupt it when it's actually happening. And so social support from your immediate supervisor and your teammates is really the most critical buffer between you and work stress. It helps us to feel less stressed overall. It helps us when we are stressed to recover from it. So having caring, collaborative coworkers, feeling like your immediate supervisor cares about you, these are the things that can make a massive difference in our well-being on the job. Of course, everybody's really stressed out right now because it's not just your brain on COVID. Everybody's brain is on COVID and 2020, 21, right? So we have less available for good communication with each other and patience and empathy. So we're all struggling a little bit to bring our best selves to work and to our coworkers. It's important to remember, though, that our nervous systems, just like those redwood trees, are talking to each other all the time. Our stress is contagious. And, we know what that is when we're around somebody that's really activated or we're around someone who's really calm. We feel a shift in ourselves, and that's our nervous systems talking to each other. For people who are in a leadership role, your position magnifies your impact. So you're extra contagious in terms of your stress and your perspective and your resilience. So if you're really stressed out, if your nervous system's really jacked up, it's talking to everybody and it's talking louder because of that position of power that you're in. So the good news is that safety and calm are also contagious. We can help ourselves shift into that. When we are calm, when we are grounded, it helps the other person to get regulated as well. So some of the ways that we can do that for each other is when we're stressed out, we can have an agreement with a buddy at work that we're allowed to talk to each other for a few minutes, sharing what's going on and how we're feeling. But the other person's job is just to listen and to not give any advice. So no fixing, no interrupting, no advice. And first responders at 9/11 said that this was one of the most helpful things for them, was to have someone, a buddy that was trusted, that would just listen without trying to fix anything. We can also ask for and allow others to help us. So we're good at sometimes helping others. We're not so great at asking for and allowing other people to help us. I think one of the most powerful questions we can ask when we see someone is stressed out is to just ask, what can I do to help? Right? And that helps them move back into that place of choice. So we're not saying like, move out of the way, I'll handle it, or ignore them. We're really asking them to think about, what do you need right now that I could do to help out? And sometimes just doing that is enough, because it shifts them into a position where they're back to making choices rather than just reacting. We can offer more gratitude and appreciation. That often also triggers a release of oxytocin for us when we feel really appreciated. And so being really generous with telling people in the moment that you appreciate them or what you're grateful for, the positive impact that they're making. It's not just nice. It really does help you on a lot of levels, including physiologically. And then we can snuggle with the animals. That also gives us an oxytocin release. So even if there's no one around that's a human that can help us out, we can go cuddle with the animals, and that can help us feel more calm and safe. We can also bring co-regulation into our meetings and do it on the spot. So in meetings, it might look like, can we start our meetings with a minute or two of deep breathing, with the understanding that we're all really activated. So let's just kind of move ourselves below threshold and, make some space for the challenges that are coming today. On the spot, that may look like understanding that if you have a staff member or a coworker, or you are really upset about something, now's not the time to have a really in-depth conversation about what went wrong, because your prefrontal cortex isn't available. What you can do is to help the other person or yourself get regulated first. So if someone is hot, take them on a walk and bring water and allow them to talk, the hot walk and talk. You're walking, so they're sweating. You're feeding them some water, a bottle or two, so they're flushing out that stress hormones with water, and you're just listening so that they can talk through what just happened. And once they feel more calm, that's when maybe you could sit down and have a conversation about, what happened, or fill out an incident report. But first, you want to let them reduce that activation and arousal so they can access their brain. So hot walk and talk is pretty helpful. Again, this is always about self-care and we care. That was my last presentation. We want to be able to do these self-regulation practices for ourselves, but we also want to make room for these types of co-regulation and safety increasing behaviors and practices in the workplace. So finally, it's shifting from feeling like what you're doing is meaningless, there's no point, to feeling like what you're doing is the most meaningful thing you could be doing right now. And so our perceptions clearly impact our stress. If we perceive something as threatening, our stress response sets off. If we are perceiving that things are going to go badly in the future, we're going to experience more stress. So one of the ways that we can work with our perceptions to reduce our stress is reframing the challenges of the work and our ability to meet those challenges in a more constructive way. So how many of you think that the work that you're doing with animals is meaningful work? I'd love to know in the chat if that strikes you as a truth for you. And it particularly may not this past year because of how stressed out everybody is. But generally speaking, would you say that the work that you do is meaningful work? You can let us know in the chat.
Everybody is responding very emphatically, yes.
Yay. Okay, that's good news. But meaningful work is almost always stressful work, right? It's very difficult to have a meaningful life and a meaningful job and to not experience stress. So Kelly McGonigal, who wrote the book, The Upside of Stress, has been known to say stress and meaning are inextricably linked because you don't stress out about things that you don't care about. And you can't create a meaningful life without experiencing some stress. And I think that that's really important to remember because I think we sometimes are just under this assumption that things should be different. They shouldn't be so challenging or they shouldn't be so stressful. But the truth is that when anything has meaning, when something is at stake that we value, it's likely that we're going to feel stressed. It is difficult work that we're doing. And to live a life that is totally stress-free, often it means that there's not a lot of meaning there either. So we really do want to do this meaningful work, which means we opt in for stress in our lives, right? And so we can reframe stress as the price of admission that we willingly choose to pay in order to access this very meaningful work. In other words, it's thinking, okay, I signed up for this. I choose this particular flavor of stress because it leads to the work that's most meaningful for me. Every job has some sort of stress in it, right? There's no job ever that you're going to ask people, is if they have, nothing to, everybody has something to complain about. Everybody's stressed out by their job, but only some of us are lucky enough to do work that's also meaningful. And so I think, there's a particular way that this work is stressful, but there's also a particular way that this work is deeply meaningful and that most of us wouldn't want to miss out on that particular kind of meaning, which means the flip side is, okay, it comes with the side of stress. It's not being done to me. I'm not a victim of it. I'm really opting in. I want this kind of stress, as weird as that sounds, because that is the ticket to the things that are most meaningful to me. So to kind of close out our discussion today, I'd love to know, what's a meaningful experience that you've had at work over the last few weeks. And I'm going to do a recap after this, but I'd really love to know before we go if there's something meaningful that you can take some time to recall, because often the good stuff just goes right out of our memory, and we have to make an active effort to be able to reconnect with and recall and re-experience the meaningful things of our work, because that helps to buoy us against all of the stress. So if anybody's sharing anything in the chat, I'd love to know. And if it's hard, this is what always happens. It's way easier to come up with all the things that are stressful about the job, but we need to make it more explicit what is meaningful and what we appreciate about the work to counterbalance how easy it is to be connected to that stress and the negative stuff.
Someone on the team was promoted, and they've grown so much in the 2 years that they've worked together. So a lot of pride from this manager.
Oh, that's really cool. So a lot of mutual support.
Yeah. Reunited a cat with the owner, and the owner has been sending updates.
Yay.
So happy. Watching a team member do the most fear-free transfer of a cat into a carrier.
Oh, nice. Please tell them, if you haven't already, tell them how much you appreciate that.
Yes.
We need to hear it.
Helping stressed out cats that go into my office go from terrified and angry to relaxed and social, ready to find new homes.
Yeah.
Comforting a scared dog, seeing her come around to happiness.
Yeah.
Helping volunteers work on a difficult project, and they've all stepped up.
Nice.
Admirably. helped an owner through a really tough euthanasia decision, and she was so appreciative that she called back weeks later to make a donation.
Oh, that's life-changing stuff, right? For everybody. That's big stuff. Yeah. So it's all throughout our day, all throughout our week, these things are happening. One of the things that we can do for ourselves is to notice in the moment when they're happening, which sounds really obvious, but we don't do it, right? We want to be aware in the moment when the meaningful things are happening so we don't miss them, and we can really soak them in, and they can buoy us through all of the stress. We need to be really connected to this. So the short version of how we can reduce our stress is to increase meaning, to increase the support that we give and that we receive. So we want to, support is so important. So really boost support in your organization and to focus on how we can increase our sense of control. All of this can help us shift from the distress to that more positive form of stress. So 3 protective stress mantras to try to help us hold on to this is, to remember, I'm not alone. We're all in this together. There's so many people that are experiencing this. I'm not alone in this challenge. This is meaningful. This is maybe the most meaningful thing I could be doing with my time. And I have choices. I can cope. I have skills. I have choices in this moment. What do I want to do? And so in terms of how we self-regulate, it's that awareness of what's going on internally as well as your stress triggers. You cannot change what you don't notice. So you've got to notice what's happening in real time so you can assess what's within your control and figure out what choices you want to make so that you can behave with integrity and dignity and then address it, pausing to pump the brakes all day long to bring yourself away from that overwhelm and threshold. When we do that, when we really step up for ourselves and for each other, when we increase the amount of care that we're giving ourselves and our staff, it helps to balance that equation so that even though times are still challenging, even though there's a lot of stress and distress, when we really increase those internal and external caring resources, it reduces the likelihood that we will injure ourselves or others, and it increases the likelihood that we will be able to be resilient and potentially even grow, not despite the challenges, but because of them. Post-stress growth and resilience is absolutely possible. We can grow because of the adversity and the challenges that we're experiencing. The short version is we can grow through what we go through. That's possible, but only when we really get the support that we need and we care for ourselves generously. So the last thing I'll ask is just if there's something that you want to remember today, you don't have to share it in the chat, or you can if you want to, but it's important to try to remember, one thing to hold on to that spoke to you today that you might be able to implement for yourself or your team. The last thing that you think about is probably what you're going to remember. So just taking a second to focus on what that might be so you have a takeaway, a little nugget to bring back into your everyday life. And then I'll just say thank you for everything that you do and who you are in the world. I appreciate you all so, so much. And if you have questions at any time, you can reach me at jessica@jessicadolce.com. I'm here for questions now, but I know sometimes it's awkward to ask questions in person, in front of other people. So you can always email me. And yeah, I think that that's it. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen so I can see if there are any questions. And yeah, here we are. So how are we doing? What's on your minds before we head out?
Nothing yet. And Jess, I'm just going to share. I'm going to share your resources page on your website, just in case people want to visit that and see what else you.
I don't know if they were able to get the PDF that I sent. It has a bunch of these exercises in detail and explained a little bit more. So hopefully we can get that.
Yeah, we will.
Okay. Yeah, so the PDF, if come back for it, it has a lot of those self-regulation practices and some others I didn't mention explained in greater detail, along with some kind of questions that you can use to help figure out your stress response and what might work for you. Yeah. You're welcome, everybody. Thank you for participating and sharing in the chat. It's really helpful for, I think, everybody to see how we're all relating to these stressful times that we're in. Yeah. Is there anything else? I'm not sure. Yeah.
I'm just trying to check on that. Well, if people have other questions, I'll respond in the chat in one sec.
I think my impression is it's going to be uploaded into this.
It probably will with the presentation.
Yeah. So you just may have to check back like in a few hours or tomorrow. That is my impression. Are there any questions or anything? You're welcome, everyone. Let me see if there's anything. Oh, here's one. Suggestions for how to break out of wasting time, which causes me stress, not just at work, often after work. So break out of wasting time. Huh. Well, I think the question to ask yourself is why are you wasting time? And it may be that you're really shutting down because you've been pushing yourself really hard at work. So you just may be really starting to slow down and shut down, kind of going into more of like the freeze response of stress, if that's what you're talking about. And it's hard to get activated. So sometimes the way that we deal with that is to manage our stress differently during the day to reduce some of that activation so we don't crash so hard when we get home. And I think a lot of times when we crash, we just do things like, binge watch television. We do like really passive things because we're really tapped out. So sometimes it's the cumulative effect of managing our stress and taking care of our bodies that allows us to have enough more sustainable energy to engage with self-care after work or practices that might support you that's more active and less passive. I'm not really sure if I'm getting that. It's a good question. I'm not sure if I'm giving you a good answer. It may be that you just put a time on it, like you give yourself an hour after work to be just a really low energy and to let yourself rest, or to really rest, like take a nap, and then move on to, cooking dinner or taking care of your pets. But wasting time is a signal in some ways that like your needs aren't getting met. And so it's what do you actually need and how can you give it to yourself in that moment in some capacity. So yeah, I think sometimes it's like you're just really, really tired too. So some people I know work in shelters that are really happy come home and they immediately take like a 15-minute nap to let themselves recharge, and then they have the energy for the rest of their day. So it might be different for each person. What's the best way to approach your boss if you see her beyond stress and not functioning well, especially if he doesn't realize the profound impact it has on others? This is really tough. It depends on your relationship with your boss, whether or not you're safe enough to have these conversations, depending on what the power dynamic is. So one way is just to start having, I always say this when I give a webinar, you can just have the conversation in kind of a general way. Hey, I just went to this webinar. I learned about stress, how our nervous systems get really jacked up and influence each other. So you can kind of use the webinar as a way to just talk about this. Have you ever experienced this? Have you ever noticed that someone else's stress is really contagious and has an impact? And it might be a kind of a safer way to broach the topic. I think also, one way to think about it is always just how would you want to be approached if you were really maxed out and behaving in a way that was having a negative impact on everybody? How would you want to be approached in a way where you wouldn't feel embarrassed and ashamed and you might be receptive to talking about it? So, that's, I think, one way to potentially have this conversation. The other bit was if your boss has a peer, someone, or your boss has a boss, maybe, that can talk to them about it as well. So it depends on the specifics. These are good questions. As usual, I'm not sure if I'm giving great answers, but let's see. Any advice for someone who's exposed to a chronically unhappy coworker? How do you not let it affect you? Yeah. So, you can be direct and say like, look, I'm trying, for my own, stress, and resilience. I'm trying really hard to focus on having like constructive conversations, or, not complaining or not gossiping, or like whatever it is. So can we switch the topic to something, that's a little bit more positive, or avoiding them as much as you can, if that's with something that you have control over. I think sometimes one way that we can help ourselves is to find other like-minded people and kind of create a micro culture of folks that are interested in creating a healthier work environment. So that person's probably not it. Is there one or two or three other people on your staff that want to experiment with communicating with each other in different ways, bringing some self-care into the workplace, and then the 2 or 3 or 4 of you create your own little microculture that is really supportive. And, you can share that you're doing that with that other person and let them know how much better you feel if you do feel better because you've changed the way that you talk about the work, because you're taking a break from complaining, or you're focusing more on some of the things that you appreciate. But you cannot control what that person does. So sometimes it's really focusing on what you do have control over, which is pouring more energy into those relationships that are supportive. If that person is really toxic, I mean, that's where a leadership needs to step in. And I'll say that for everyone who's listening, who's in a leadership role, when there is a person on staff who is really toxic and negative, has a massive impact on everybody on the staff. And, you as the person in power need to be the one that addresses it. Otherwise, you wind up sacrificing your whole team for that person. So we need to step in on behalf of the well-being of our staff and address that behavior, depending on what it is. These are, again, all good questions. Did I miss anything else? Let's see. Going back to the chat. Let's see. Is there a kinder way to say, I'm always available to listen if you want to talk, but may have no solutions for you? I feel that sometimes perceive I don't care if no. Yeah. Okay. That's a great question. I actually, you may feel that you're being perceived that way, but, often people just want to be, listened to. It is a great, great gift in this world where everybody's distracted by their phones, as we all talked about, to give someone your full attention. I wish I could remember the research around this, but it's like, it takes like 30 seconds for there to be positive responses, physiological, when someone is listening to you. Like, it doesn't take that long for us to start feeling better when we've got somebody's full compassionate attention. And so I think being able to say, I'm here to listen. I'll do my best to support you. I'm not always going to have answers, but often it helps me to just share what's on my mind to someone who is kind and patient. That in and of itself is the kind of support that most of us need. It's okay to just admit that you don't know how to fix it, or that you don't have an answer right now. Whatever. I think just being explicit about that. This is what I can offer. This is what I may not be able to do, but I'm here for you. I think you're probably underestimating how much it is helpful for them just to be listened to. We feel a lot of stress activation when we can't fix things for other people. That's our own stuff to manage. As helpers, it really bugs us and stresses us out when we can't give advice or fix things. But actually, when we do that, when we try to give advice and fix things, it often makes the person who is talking to us feel like we're not listening, and they feel even more, feel less supported. So sometimes it's our own stress that we have to manage around not having a fix for that person. So I think just being explicit about it, we know that, just talking about these things help. And, you can ask them like what their suggestions are. What would they like to see? What fixes would they like to see happen? And you may not be able to do those right away, but you can listen to what their suggestions are. So I hope that was helpful. Do not underestimate how helpful it is just to listen, even for just a few minutes. It's okay that we can't fix it. Yeah. Yeah. Right. And so a big part, I think, of our work, and Amy, that's super helpful, is to recognize when we are activated by something, when we are stressed out by something, and then we self-regulate, and then we are able to be more fully present for what's actually happening in reality. And just to understand, a lot of what we may be feeling it's internal, and it's our perceptions of what other people expect of us, or it's our perceptions of what we should be able to do. But if we can self-regulate in those moments and ease up on ourselves, we might be able to be present just to hold some space for people in a compassionate way. Anything else before we go? You guys are also smart and kind. These are all great questions. I'm so close to the camera. My God. I don't want to miss out on anything, but I think that might, is that it? Okay. Yeah. Chris wants to know if you're doing a survey on this session.
Yep. I was going to talk about that in a second. I was just giving you a couple more minutes to see if people had questions, but yeah, we will include the link in the chat in a minute.
Oh, I just saw it. Thanks, Katie, for adding that there'll be, resources will be added. Okay. Yeah. In the documents section. Awesome. Yeah.
Okay. It seems like we are good.